like to pass the virtual microphone to William Halal, who is Professor Emeritus of a number of subjects at George Washington University. So, William, you can start sharing your screen while I'm introducing you. Your subjects at George Washington University include science, technology, management, and innovation. And you're also the founder of TechCast, which is an international think tank that pools the knowledge of experts. Again, there's this theme of the distilling shared wisdom, pooling the knowledge of experts to forecast breakthroughs in technology, social trends, and wildcards to assist decision makers, such as the politicians that Rohit mentioned, but other decision makers too, in managing a changing world. Your subject, William, is Beyond Knowledge, Ethics and the Future. The floor is yours.
It's a great pleasure to be here. My work has changed in the last several years. I had focused on the technology revolution as such, and I think we did a great job of forecasting technology breakthroughs. But now I've recently focused on the impact of technology because it's so clear to me that the technology itself is not as important as the social impact it's having, which is enormous. The title of my talk, for instance, tells you what I'm about to tell you about. I'm going to describe how I think the digital revolution is moving the world beyond knowledge. I think we've moved beyond knowledge now. We are operating beyond knowledge now. Values and beliefs are dominant. And I think this means we are entering the early stages of an age of consciousness. That is the essence of what I'm going to tell you about. And I think it's revolutionary. It changes everything. So let's go on here. This is a summary of what I'm going to describe. You can see these terms here. I'd like you to get familiar with these terms that I'm going to use. I'm going to start with a scenario of our work that we've done. And then why is the world moving beyond knowledge to an age of consciousness? I'm going to make that argument, and I think it's convincing. And then I show the big picture, the life cycle of evolution, which is, I think, a breakthrough. I have done very original and important work in this area. I think it helps us understand the role of social evolution. And then the crisis of global maturity. That is the challenge that the world faces now. It seems almost impossible. And then a mental spiritual revolution, I think, is likely to resolve the crisis of global maturity. And I think it's likely within this decade. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call technologies of consciousness, the ways that we use to change consciousness, to alter our consciousness, our mood, our awareness, which is becoming increasingly important, and institutions, how they should change with this new type of consciousness. And I want to say a word about the cover of the book here on the right that you can see. I've put a lot of thought into this cover, and I think it does a nice job. This lovely girl is a modern goddess, and she is giving humanity a vision of a mature world. All of these concepts make up that vision. It's a global consciousness, and that's what the book is about, all of these concepts. So I'm very pleased with the cover. Now, here's our scenario for 2030. And much of this is pretty well known to most futurists. I think sustainability will arrive during this decade to a large extent. But the question is, how bad will the environment get? Because the climate problem is enormous now, and it's going to get worse. Even if everything were done proper right now, it would get worse. So the question is, how bad is it going to get? It's a serious crisis. And I think we're going to see green transportation, all of that, self-driving cars and all that, medicine, mastery over life. And then here's our wild cards come in. Threats across the spectrum. I don't think this is going to be a utopia. It's going to be a very difficult world. All of these possible dangers. We're seeing the pandemic now. We were forecasting this years ago, and all these other things, a shift in the climate, cyber war, and all that sort of thing. And surprisingly, the next item, higher order values. This is a note of optimism. We find in our social trends that there are these positive trends that are human-oriented, like social responsibility, transparency, and so forth. This is a very important development. It tells us something about how the new world is evolving. And then here at Infinite Knowledge Intelligence, that's where we're going. And as AI automates routine thought, the question is posed, what follows knowledge? This is the biggest issue of our time. When AI automates knowledge work, what will humans do? What lies beyond knowledge? And I'm going to tell you that I think beyond knowledge is consciousness by definition, simply by definition. And that leads to all of these concepts that I'm going to talk about. So let me move on. Here's the argument I'm going to make for why we're moving beyond knowledge to subjective consciousness. At the right, you see this pyramid, which describes the structure of consciousness, these different cognitive functions that humans all perform. It starts with perception, awareness, and so forth, and moves up to these more ethereal functions like peak experiences and vision. Well, the interesting thing is that AI is automating the objective functions right now. This is the easy stuff. This is what AI is good at. So I'm going to show you how we're automating the objective, simple stuff, and it's moving society into the subjective realm. And that's where it gets difficult. For instance, the first bullet here, the knowledge revolution is a great success. There are 16 billion PCs, smartphones, and laptops for 8 billion people. That's 2 computers per individual on average in the planet. So the knowledge age has arrived. There's no shortage of knowledge. It's a great success. Now we're moving beyond knowledge. Everything beyond knowledge is subjective consciousness, as you can see here in this pyramid. And that has introduced social media, which is, I think, representative of the biblical story of eating fruit from the tree of knowledge. It's dangerous. Knowledge is dangerous. And that has created all of this emotion and controversy and disinformation on social media, which is a relatively new phenomena. And it is serious. It is deadly serious. In the United States, we talk of it as the post-factual world, where facts don't count any longer. And people are speaking from beliefs and values. And we've seen that in the form of the big lie that the 20,000 presidential election was stolen, in the resistance to use vaccination because people have these terrible fears that are just made up, and the reluctance to accept climate change. And in fact, if Trump were to win the 2024 presidential election, I think we might see a civil war in the United States. I think that's a possibility. People are talking about that. That's how serious this is. Let me move on. Okay, now here's and I'm sorry, I don't know what to do about this, but these images at the right are obstructing the main part of this graph. I don't know how to get rid of this. Let me try something.
We're seeing it fine.
Yeah, okay, good.
You can move them out of the way.
Yeah, I think we're okay now. I think this is really an important chart. There are people who have talked about this, but nobody has ever done a really good chart with real scales and real data. And that's what I have here. To make this work, I had to use a log scale at the bottom because otherwise you wouldn't see anything. If you were to plot this on ordinary scales, it would be just a flat line. It would turn sharp right at the very end. You wouldn't see anything. But on a log scale, it stretches out the present so you can see what's happening here. And the vertical scale is simply these different stages of evolution. And most of this is well established. I mean, it's common knowledge almost. And what impressed me is that when I first plotted this, I was amazed that the curve fit precisely. Usually when you plot data and try and find the best fit, there's scatter. And any technical person knows that. In this case, there's no scatter. It's a perfect fit of an S-curve, which in itself tells us something. This is, I think, an accurate depiction of the way civilization has evolved on this planet. And I want to call your attention to what's happening recently. This is a critical point here, the saturation point which is the crisis of maturity that I will talk about more fully later. I think we are focused on that now. It's become obvious that this is a roadblock to progress. You can stop people on the street and ask them if they think the present trajectory is going to succeed, and they'll say no. They don't agree with that. They think we're heading for disaster. The pandemic has made that clear, and that is, I think, also this period, the year 2020, is the beginning of the age of consciousness. I think, for the reasons I mentioned a minute ago, consciousness is now a dominant force in modern societies. And I focus on the year 2020 because that was when we saw in the United States an unprecedented thing, an attempted coup on our government. And that makes it very clear that we're operating beyond knowledge and we are in a crisis of maturity, I think. So that's why I think I have confidence in this data point, 2020, at the saturation point where we face a crisis of maturity and the beginning of an age of consciousness. And then the mental spiritual revolution. Now, I know that sounds like a big stretch, but every one of these stages of evolution has been fostered, has been driven by a revolution: the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, the post-industrial revolution, the information revolution. And so if I'm correct, and I think I am, an age of consciousness is going to be ushered in by a mental spiritual revolution in this decade. I'm not talking about 20 or 30 years, in this decade. I know we're going to have more to say about that later. Let me move on. So here's the crisis of global maturity. This is something Michael Marion and I did a few years ago. And if anything, the problem is more severe now. We did a trend analysis and we looked at, there's so many trends driving the crisis and so few that are resolving it. And the survey data shows that 60 to 70% of people think there's a high probability of catastrophe or disaster. And this is common knowledge, I think. As I say, the pandemic has highlighted this. People think the system doesn't work. So there is serious thought being given to what would be the new system. And the problem, of course, are lack of leadership and political will and so forth. Now, here is what the mental spiritual revolution, I think, is about. As I said, all stages are driven by revolution, so this is not unusual. The present world order is not sustainable. I think that's pretty self-evident to most people. The World Economic Forum and many others have acknowledged this. The World Economic Forum is calling for a global reset in all spheres of society. The life cycle of evolution shows that we are now at the last stage of social evolution, consciousness. This completes the life cycle of evolution on this planet. I think that's true. I suppose we could argue about that, but it seems to me self-evident. Consciousness is the culminating phase in social evolution, and it signifies maturity. And so we're facing the need to achieve excuse me, I'm going to turn this off. Planetary maturity. And it's similar to we're familiar with maturity, the process of maturity. Every teenager goes through this. If anybody's raised children, they know this. A teen struggles to become an adult, and at some point they face the reality that they have to grow up, they accept responsibility for their behavior, and they develop a coherent vision of where they want to go. That's roughly what the world has to do now. We have to grow up, accept responsibility for our behavior, and become a mature society. And there are trends moving in this direction. Not many, but there are some. The Me Too movement, I think, has been powerful. It's changed attitudes around the world. Women are protected now pretty much from sexual predators. The Black Lives Matters movement has also become global. People of color are fiercely objecting to being treated badly. And the most striking change is that business is on the verge of becoming democratic. Who would have thought this? 50 years ago, I won the Mitchell Prize for my paper, Beyond the Profit Motive. And it made perfect sense at that time, but it's taken 50 years to realize that vision. It's here now. The Business Roundtable in the United States has announced that business should no longer focus on profit alone. They should include the interests of all stakeholders. And that means it's no longer capitalism. It's kind of a democratic system. We're just beginning to figure out how to do that. If we do it properly, it will be a competitive advantage. It will not be the old concept of social responsibility. It will be good for business and good for society at large. So we face the prospect of a model of the corporation that not only maximizes profit, but that solves social problems as well as one of its main objectives. That is revolutionary, I think. It's a different consciousness in business and economics. And as I say, I think this is likely in this decade. So here's what we have in mind for a global consciousness, which I think is what we need. The world needs some kind of a vision, a plan for where we are heading, where we're not going to get there. And we've done some work on this at TechCast with our collective intelligence. And we have used this with groups, and we find that it makes good sense to people, but it demands a lot. This is not, by the way, a utopia or fantasy. This is a vision of what is needed for a sustainable world. It's practical. And here you can see the principles here. I'm not going to go into them in detail because I don't have time, but you can get the gist of this. And I think it makes perfect sense to most people. We need something like this. And if we can do this, and I think it's likely, in a few years, we will see perhaps something like a global ethics or a collective epiphany or a united world order or something. It could take various forms. And I think it will probably mature about 2050. My guess is that's when we will see a unified world, not a perfect world, not a utopian world, but a world that works. I was forecasting the start of the knowledge age in the 70s when I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley. And it turned out I was right. I have a sense for this kind of thing. It happened exactly around the year 2000. That's the way I feel about this forecast for 2050 as the dawn of some kind of a unified globe. I feel confident in this. I can't give you a lot of specific reasons. I just feel that that is probably about the period that it's likely to happen, plus or minus 10 years. And I'm getting ready to wrap up here. Here's something about what I call technologies of consciousness. We always have been using ways to control our mind because just to cope with the world, to keep ourselves under control. These are methods that we use to manage our minds. And we're going to have to do this more completely, more intensely in order to resolve the crisis of global maturity and to keep our sanity, because the world is getting more complex, more turbulent. And these are things that we're going to have to do to maintain our mental equilibrium. And here's something about institutions. This is where it has to end up. We have to change the way institutions work. We talked about the corporation changing to a different consciousness that is quasi-democratic. Something is required in government. The reason we're seeing autocracies around the world is because democratic government is not working well. It's become so bureaucratic that we can't get anything done. Look at the way China can act because it doesn't have to worry about democracy. So we have to revise government dramatically. And the main thing we have to do is bring enterprise and markets into government systems. This was started in the United States about 30 or 40 years ago, but it was aborted, and we need something like that now. I'm not going to go through the rest of these institutions, but you get the idea. All institutions are going to have to change. So that sums up my talk. I think I'm pretty good on time. I want to just take a moment here to sum up the significance of what I've been talking about. I know this is hard to grasp. It asks a lot of you. It asks you to change your way of thinking, but that's exactly what we have to do. We have to think in terms of consciousness now, not knowledge, not technology, consciousness. It's here before us right now. That is the main problem we have in a strange form of consciousness that doesn't recognize facts and science. We have to shape a consciousness that's going to work, that's going to create a sustainable world. We have to control our own consciousness. And so I think the world is heading towards a what I'm going to call a moment of truth. This decade. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found this useful.
That's another fine round of applause there. I hope you can still hear me. Professor Halal, well, how do you respond to people who might say that this is a fine, inspiring vision, but it's actually a bit naive? That you talk about a knowledge revolution, but there's actually an increase in disinformation and people feeling oppressed as a result. You talk about growth of consciousness, but there is a lot more tribalism and divisiveness, populism, and even, as you said, civil war. What gives you the confidence to say that these trends will be kept in place and we'll get to your perceived age of consciousness instead?
I'm not confident. I am optimistic, but there's no assurance this will happen. I want to make that clear. It depends on how the world reacts in this next decade. Next decade, I think, is crucial. But I'm making the point that if we don't, we're heading for disaster. I don't see how the world can survive, how civilization can survive if we don't meet these great challenges, the crisis of global maturity.
Give you the same question that I asked Eric. Do you consider calling yourself a transhumanist as part of this journey to greater consciousness, or is that a term you prefer to avoid?
Now, I'm an older man. I have new lenses in my eyes. I have hearing aids. I'm incorporating technology in my life right now. So I think we're all becoming transhumanists. And I do agree with the principle of transhumanism. I think the technology is going to dominate our lives, no question about that. We will merge with the technology. I think that's true.
Eric, would you like to ask any question now, or Rohit? Please do.
Bill, thank you. It's very interesting to listen to you, and also those try that the concept that you developed as the coming, you try to label some period after the current one, and so on and so forth, and that's exactly along the line that I want to advocate too. That we have to try to create some concepts describing future developments, which is not a negation of what is, but it's also wanted to be creative and try to conceptualize something new in one way or another. So when that is said, I also have one question regarding your approach. So you have this technology forecast institution as a bottom line, which I think is very, very important. But a long-standing tradition within the future field is also foresight using methodology that's go beyond forecasting. And how do you relate to foresight scenario development as methodologically in your work, if you can say one or two words about that?
Well, yeah, I presented a scenario for the year 2030. So we use scenarios at TechCast, absolutely. We tend to focus on most likely scenarios. We don't do a lot of work in alternative scenarios, although we have done some, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Bill, Rohit here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
So given what you were saying about moving sort of beyond just thinking about the technologies to really thinking about this broader domain of consciousness, for someone, let's say, coming out of university and preparing themselves for the future, where would you put the balance between understanding the defining technologies of our age and immersing themselves in the kind of elements of consciousness? How would you balance that?
That's really a great question. I will be giving talks on my book to colleagues at GW University, and they're going to be shocked when I tell them that we're moving beyond knowledge, because the life of academics is about knowledge. They think they are accumulating facts from the past, and they resist future studies for that reason, because it's not factual. And so when I tell them that we're moving beyond knowledge, they're going to be shocked. I think it means that the knowledge, this does not negate knowledge, of course. I hope that's clear. Knowledge is still crucial, no question about that. It's simply that the higher order subjective functions dominate knowledge. They define the knowledge we choose to accept. And that's what we see now in this post-factual nonsense that's around the world. People believe what they choose to believe. They don't care about the facts. The facts are chosen to support their beliefs. It shows that the power of subjective consciousness is dominant. And so it simply means for academics that they have to introduce the concept of consciousness as the framework within which they present knowledge. They're entirely compatible, I think, Rohit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I know this asks a lot. This asks a lot of you. It asks you to change your mode of thinking quite a bit. But I think that's exactly what we have to do. I think the world is changing in a very unusual way. And I have devoted years to understanding this very problem. And I think this is a good first shot at understanding an age of consciousness. Most people think of consciousness as benign, new age, do good. That's not consciousness.
Yeah, I believe, hello. I think that is a fantastic point that you made, because then you link future research, future thinking to also the post-factual development, that trend that's going on at the time being, just to be one possible answer to those challenges that are being raised through that development. But yeah, I think that's a great point. Yes.
Yeah, consciousness is everything. And right now we're seeing a very bad form of consciousness. And that's why we have to rise to the occasion somehow. I don't know how. I don't think we can say how this is going to happen, but I think it's very likely to happen in this decade. A shift in global consciousness, a shift in the way we think about the world.
Universal perspective.
Let's hold that thought. Let's give applause to William Halal for leading the conversation.
Thank you very much.